Religion in the American Founding. How much of an influence did religion have on the American Revolution? After all, the Bible was the most quoted document by the American founders. However, the second most quoted source was from French philosopher and lawyer Montesquieu. How does one determine which ideology was more influential? Can these views be compatible and equally attributed to the creation of a new republic? In order to answer these questions, it is important to examine the deeply embedded religious history of America, and equally important to examine what Americans knew about classic literature and philosophies. Colonial America. Many that migrated over to the New World did so in hopes that they could practice their own religion apart from persecution. It was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that John Winthrop would envision a city upon a hill for all the world to see. The idea was to create a moral society that could reflect God's kingdom on earth. However, as migration increased over time, there was a lack of qualified clergy, which led to a shortage of clergymen among the colonies. The solution would be to elect laymen to lead their congregations. This led to a religious tradition consisting of religious communities with an ecclesiastical structure similar to the republican form of government. This included people choosing their own leaders, paying their ministers' salaries, and dividing governance between clergy and the congregation. In this regard, Patricia Bonomi states, colonial religious life was determinative of American political responses, including responses to the American Revolution. She also states, ecclesiastical government was not hierarchical, but republican in structure and practice, which made them inherently sympathetic to civil republicanism. But could this alone be enough to muster support for the American War of Independence over 200 years later? An examination of American religious life during the early 18th century may give further insight into this matter. The First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 40s focused on a renewed morality and religious experience which brought a common identity to evangelicalism. It was Allen Heimert who first brought the idea that the First Great Awakening was directly tied to the American Revolution. It was the radical Calvinist view of the Great Awakening which not only focused on dependence on God, but interdependence on his fellow man that would be what Heimert refers to as the most enduring of Calvinist contributions to American thought and practice. It would also be the focus on millenarianism, the belief in a coming ideal society that would reemerge in the American mind during the First Great Awakening. The idea that man's efforts could assist in advancing the kingdom was inherited from the Puritans and spread fervently in the early 18th century. Yet the First Great Awakening did not see complete uniformity within Christianity. It was often divided between Puritan Calvinism versus Arminian rationalism, or New Lights versus Old Lights. The Old Lights focused on orthodox theology and interpreting Calvinism in a rationalistic manner, while New Lights focused on religious experience and emotional expressions. Yet New Light ministers were not completely devoid of using reason when it came to rights and liberties. New Light minister Elisha Williams wrote in 1744 in a letter to his friend in Connecticut, "As reason tells us, all are born thus naturally equal, with equal rights to their persons." And because of this, he goes on to say, "Thus every man having a natural right to his own person and his own actions and labor, and to what he can honestly acquire by his labor, which we shall call property, it certainly follows that no man can have a right to the person or property of another, and if every man has a right to his person and property, he also has a right to defend them and a right to all the necessary means of defense. This idea of defending personal rights would continue and be prevalent amongst clergy during the Revolutionary era. One of the most notable and outspoken ministers during the Revolutionary era was Jonathan Mayhew. In his A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers, he argues against universal authority to civil powers and states that the apostles' command in Romans 13 only applies to good government which execute good laws. He further argues that no civil ruler is to be obeyed when they enjoin the things that are inconsistent with the commands of God. It was not just the clergy that understood the importance of justifying independence through the lens of religious ideals. In this regard, Emory Elliott states, Jefferson and his fellow intellectuals understood about their countrymen was that religious feeling flowed like an underground river through the colonies from New England to Georgia. Founders would rely on clergy to draw upon the deeply embedded religious ideals to muster support for the revolution. Previous themes of Puritan morality being equated with the blessings of a nation would reemerge. This is evident in Samuel Langdon's address to the courts and legislature just a few weeks prior to the ratification of the Constitution. He reminds the legislature that what will secure a nation is to abide by the statutes given by the Lord to the Israelites in Deuteronomy. If America would abide by the wisdom and statutes of the Lord, she will raise her reputation high among all the nations. Many of the clergy seized upon the opportunity to revive excitement and moral laxity that had cooled since the First Great Awakening. But were the colonists devoid of any influence besides religious rhetoric? Bernard Bailyn examines the literature readily available to the colonists in his book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. As Bailyn examines the pamphlets during that time, he finds that colonists randomly quoted authorities, specifically those of classical antiquity. He also claims knowledge of classical authors was universal among colonists with any degree of education. What gripped the minds of colonists, Bailyn claims, was the political history of Rome, the establishment of the empire, and the ruins of the republic. Knowledge of what caused the downfall of the Roman Republic could help guide Americans on what to avoid when they established their own. Bailyn also highlights the influence of Enlightenment rationalism. The writings of Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, among others, were often cited to appeal to natural rights. It is interesting to note that Bailyn does not ignore the religious aspect of influence during the American Revolution, but acknowledges the political and social theories of New England Puritanism. He claims these ideas throughout the 17th century had been consolidated and amplified by a succession of writers implementing the idea that America had a special place. With the overlapping of many thoughts and ideas, how can one determine what was more influential over the American Revolution, religion or Enlightenment philosophy? To answer that question, it is important to keep in mind the type of government that America created, republicanism. Derek Davis describes republicanism as a circle of ideas stressing democratic ideals, religious destiny, separation of powers in government, and a system of checks and balances to minimize the potential for corruption in political leaders. These various ideas can be found within religious thought and Enlightenment thoughts. However, potential corruption could only truly be appealed to through a higher moral authority found in Scripture. Many of the founders understood this principle, and it is captured in a quote from John Adams. "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with you and passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." Yes, the founders and colonists were highly influenced by Enlightenment ideas with creating the new republic. However, it was the influence of religious ideas that provided the only means to secure the new republic.